I stood at the gate of my son's villa on Christmas night, a tray of homemade cookies in my hands. When the door opened, he didn't hug me. He didn't invite me in. He glanced around, then said quietly, but sharp enough to hurt Dad, "You don't belong here. Go." I hadn't even understood what was happening yet, when the tray in my hands was tossed into the trash behind me. In that moment I realized something painful. I wasn't being turned away from a party. I was being erased from my own son's life. If you're listening to this and it touches something real inside you, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. And now, let me continue. Let me tell you about that Christmas night, the night when everything began to turn in a direction I never could have imagined. The oak door closed behind me. Not hard, not loud, but firm enough for me to understand. I wasn't welcome. The snow was falling heavier now. Wind slipped through the narrow, dark streets of Beacon Hill. I stood there for a few seconds, as if staying still long enough might somehow fix everything. But nothing changed. The lights inside stayed on. Laughter still drifted through the thick glass, and I stood outside, empty-handed. I didn't feel angry right away. At my age, anger doesn't rush in anymore. It comes slowly, like cold seeping through an old coat. I looked down at my worn shoes, thinking about how carefully I had cleaned them before coming. I didn't want to dirty my son's floor. A small thought, but in that moment it made me feel foolish. Julian hadn't looked me in the eye when he said those words. He looked past my shoulder, as if afraid someone inside might see this scene. I understood. Inside that villa were the people he wanted to impress. Well-fitted suits, expensive dresses, cold, firm handshakes. And me, I didn't belong to that world. At least that's what my son believed. I remember Vivian's face clearly when she stepped out. No surprise. No confusion. Just a quick glance, enough to measure, to judge. She didn't say a word to me. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke clearly enough. When the tray of cookies left my hands and landed in the trash, I heard the dry sound of metal, like a final period at the end of a sentence. I turned away without saying anything else. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew that anything I said would only make them more uncomfortable, and clearly their discomfort mattered more than my presence. I stepped down the stairs. Snow had already covered the path. Each step felt heavy, not because of age, but because of memory. I thought of other winters long ago when Julian was still small. I carried him in my arms, walked him across slippery roads in Texas, teaching him how to keep his balance. Back then I was his support. Now, I was a burden that needed to be hidden. After walking a short distance, I stopped, not from the cold, but because a very clear thought entered my mind. I took out my phone. My fingers trembled slightly, not from emotion, but from the wind. I opened my banking app and looked at the familiar line. The monthly payments for insurance and property taxes on that house. 4 years. 4 years I had carried that cost, quietly, without a single reminder. I didn't do it because of any legal obligation. I did it because he was my son, and because I had promised his mother before she passed that I would take care of him until he could stand on his own. But standing on your own doesn't mean standing on someone else's shoulders. I looked back at the villa one last time. Beautiful, solid, full of history, a place I had helped build, even though my name wasn't on the papers. I pressed cancel authorization. There was no sound, no warning, just a simple action. But I knew, from that moment on, everything had changed. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel the pain I had expected either. There was only a very clear silence, like when a room is closed off and you know you'll never return to it. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, pulled my collar up, and kept walking. On the way back to the small hotel where I was staying, I thought about what I had expected when I came. I wasn't looking for thanks. I only thought that at the very least, I would be allowed to stand in a corner of the room and watch my son smile on Christmas night. But maybe I had misunderstood my role for a long time. When I reached my room, I didn't turn on the light right away. I sat down in the chair and listened to the wind outside. I understood then that what had happened wasn't just an insult. It was a message, and if that was the message they chose to send, then I needed to respond in my own way. Quietly, without confrontation, simply by stopping myself from being the silent machine behind them. That night I didn't sleep much, but I didn't cry. At this age, tears don't solve anything anymore. I just lay there thinking about everything I had given, and for the first time I asked myself a question I should have asked much earlier. If I stopped paying for their life, how would they treat me then? The next morning, I woke up, before the sky fully lightened. The hotel room was so quiet I could hear the heater click on, then off. I made a weak cup of coffee and sat by the window watching the snow fall. I hadn't slept much, but my mind was clear. When you're pushed to the edges, you start looking back at what brought you there. I thought about the restaurant in Texas. That place had been my whole life. I opened it when I was young. I stood at the stove every day learning how to take responsibility for every mistake. I remembered the smell of barbecue drifting down the street each evening. I remembered regular customers calling me by name. When Julian said he needed money to start the right way, I didn't hesitate. I sold the restaurant. $350,000 in cash. I told myself it was worth it, if it meant a stable future for my son. When I signed the sale papers, my hand shook slightly, not because of the money, but because I knew I was closing a chapter of my life. Still, I believed in it. I always believed in my son, and I believed that when someone is helped at the right time, they remember. The days after Christmas moved slowly. I didn't call Julian. He didn't call me either. That silence wasn't new, but this time it had a shape. It felt like an empty space you can't pretend not to see. I spent my time walking around the neighborhood, stopping by a small grocery store, buying simple food. I lived more lightly, as if I were waiting for something even though I didn't know what. Then one afternoon, while opening an old email to look for an insurance bill, I saw a notification from the security camera system at the Beacon Hill house. I had almost forgotten about it. 4 years earlier, when I helped them move in, I had installed that system myself. Not out of suspicion, just habit. I've always believed that important things need protection. The notification was an audio file saved automatically because of a sync error. I clicked it open without expecting anything. Vivian's voice came first. Clear, calm. She was laughing. Julian replied, laughing too. But more quietly, more nervously. They were talking about the early authorization document I had signed. I remembered that paper. They told me it was just a formality, so I wouldn't have to worry later. In the recording, they called it a clever move. Vivian said that with my signature, they could take care of the rest. Julian asked, his voice lower, whether I might notice. Vivian replied that at my age, I wouldn't pay attention, that I was used to signing things, because I trusted people. I turned off the recording, not because I couldn't handle it, but because I had heard enough. What I felt wasn't anger. It was a cold clarity. Everything suddenly made sense, like wiping fog off a window and realizing the view was never different. You just hadn't looked closely before. I sat there for a long time doing nothing. I thought about Julian's phone calls, always rushed, always saying he needed more time, more support. I thought about the steady transfers of money, and I understood then. I hadn't just been pushed out of a party. I had been placed into a role they were comfortable calling a resource. That evening I called an old friend. He's a lawyer. He used to eat at my restaurant every week. We weren't close, but there was mutual respect. I didn't explain much. I just said I needed to know where I stood. On paper, we met the next day. I brought copies, notifications, and the audio recording. He listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, he didn't comfort me. He simply said there were things to be done, and if I wanted, we could do them cleanly. I told him I didn't want noise. I made that clear. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I just wanted to end an arrangement that had gone too far. He nodded. He said that sometimes withdrawing support is also a form of self-protection. On the way back, my heartbeat felt steadier. Not because I felt relieved, but because I had stopped questioning whether I was wrong. What I gave was real, but the way they used it was not. That night I played the recording again, not to hurt myself, but to remember. I needed to remember this feeling so I wouldn't fall back into old habits. When you've heard the truth with your own ears, you can't pretend you never did. I set the phone down and looked around the small room. It wasn't luxurious, but it was warm. I thought about the road ahead. I knew things wouldn't be calm from here on, but peace built on being used was never real peace. And in that silence I made a simple decision. I wouldn't say much. I would let numbers and paperwork speak. When someone is used to treating you like an invisible support, the only thing that gets their attention is when that support disappears. I didn't do anything right after that meeting. I let things drift for a few more days, long enough for the silence to spread. When you pull your hand away from a familiar wall, you start to hear the sound of things shifting, not collapsing, just small bumps, enough for others to realize something is no longer right. 1 week after Christmas, I was having a late lunch at a small place near the hotel when my phone buzzed. I didn't answer right away. I looked at the screen, saw Julian's name, then set the phone down. I wanted to see how long it would ring. It stopped. A few minutes later, a short message appeared. "No greeting. Just a question, Dad. Is there some kind of issue with the bank?" I didn't reply. I knew exactly what the issue was. The premium card under my name, the one Julian used as if it were his own, was no longer working. I imagined the moment happening somewhere I wasn't present. A bright checkout counter, a polite shake of the head, a pause that lasted a second too long. For people used to instant approval, that pause alone is enough to cause panic. That evening, the phone rang again. This time, it was Vivian. Her voice kept its familiar rhythm, calm, controlled. She said there was a small tea gathering, family-oriented, and that it would be better if I showed up to clear up the misunderstanding in front of her parents. She spoke as if I were the source of the tension. I listened until she finished. Then I said I would come. There was a brief pause on the other end, long enough for me to know they hadn't expected that answer. I added one more sentence, slow and clear. I said I would bring the most special thing I had ever prepared. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. People who are used to giving orders often believe everything is still under their control. They don't realize that when someone has been silent long enough, every agreement can carry a different meaning. In the days leading up to the gathering, I spent time with my lawyer. We didn't talk about feelings. We talked about numbers. Every transfer, every guarantee I had signed, every bill I had covered. When everything was lined up on paper, I finally saw the full picture. It wasn't help. It was a chain of dependency. The final number stopped at $420,000. I stared at it for a long time, not because I was shocked, but because I understood that if I didn't stop, that number would keep growing while my place in their lives kept shrinking. Julian called again the night before the gathering. This time his voice wasn't rushed. He asked if I needed a car sent to pick me up. I said no. I could hear the relief in his breathing, as if everything were about to fall back into place. I let him believe that. The next morning, I woke up early. I didn't prepare any food. I didn't bring knives. I didn't bring anything connected to a kitchen. I wore a simple, clean coat. Before leaving, I played the recording one more time. Not to remind myself to be angry, but to stay clear-headed. On the way to Beacon Hill, I thought about how things work when money becomes the only glue holding people together. When cash flows steadily, every behavior is overlooked. When the flow stops, questions begin. And those questions don't need to be asked loudly. When I arrived, the house looked the same. Beautiful, reserved, confident in its appearance. I walked in without rushing. No one asked what I had brought. They were used to me bringing things. They weren't used to me arriving empty-handed. Vivian smiled, a practiced smile. Julian stood behind her, his eyes unsteady. I greeted them briefly and sat down. I looked around the room at the faces I had seen on Christmas night. This time they looked at me more carefully, maybe because I wasn't standing outside the door anymore. When the expected moment came, Vivian gently mentioned the special item. I stood up. I said that what I brought wasn't meant for the table. The room went quiet. I didn't raise my voice. I simply placed a stack of papers on the table right between the cups of still steaming tea. I said that before we went any further, there were a few things that needed to be made clear. I spoke about my position, not as a father, but as the person who had stood behind everything in that house. I didn't use harsh words. I just read what was written on the page. I saw Julian lower his head. I saw Vivian tighten her grip. No one interrupted me, because at that moment I was no longer someone who needed permission to speak. In that moment I understood something clearly. My silence over all this time had done exactly what it needed to do. It had gathered every truth together so that when it was finally placed on the table, no extra explanation was required. And I knew that from here on the illusion they relied on would begin to shake. Not because I spoke loudly, but because the flow they were used to had truly stopped. No one stood up to stop me. No one laughed. The teacups were still steaming, but the room cooled fast. I didn't rush to continue. I let the silence do its work. When a truth is placed where it belongs, it doesn't need decoration. I opened the folder and turned each page slowly. I spoke about the guarantees I had signed. The times I put my name down, believing it was only temporary. I didn't use a blaming tone. I simply read. Each number marked a moment in time. Each moment was a choice I had made, believing it was for family. Someone in the room cleared their throat softly. I didn't look up. I knew they were beginning to understand why this gathering was no longer a gathering. Julian sat still, his hands folded together. I recognized that posture. It was how he sat when he didn't know what to do. Vivian was different. She kept her back straight, her eyes cold, but the hand resting on her teacup had gone still. I moved on to the next section. No extra words. I said that beyond what they already knew, there were other accounts created without my knowledge. I spoke about my signature appearing in places I had never signed. I didn't use harsh language. I called it an inconsistency, but everyone in the room understood exactly what it meant. Vivian interrupted me. The first time since I had arrived. She said there might have been a misunderstanding in how the paperwork was handled. I nodded. I said that was precisely why everything needed to be brought back to full clarity. I placed the bank confirmations and prepared legal notices on the table. That was when I finally looked up. I looked straight at Julian. Not as a wounded father, but as a man who had spent his life taking responsibility for his actions. I said those obligations were no longer protected, and that this house, despite its polished appearance, no longer belonged to a quiet family story. A few people stood up, not in anger, but because they understood they were sitting in the wrong place. This was no longer a room for pretending. I heard whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew what had been said would not stay in this room. I spoke my final sentence, slow and clear. I said I was the sole legal creditor of this house, and in that role I would reclaim it through proper procedure, not to keep it for myself. I said the house would be transferred to a foundation that supports abandoned seniors, people who once stood behind their families and were later pushed aside the way I had been. Vivian jumped to her feet. She said that was unacceptable. I didn't react. I looked toward the door where security staff had already been notified. I didn't signal them. They understood their role. There was no pushing, no raised voices, just a polite request for the gathering to end earlier than planned. Julian looked at me. This time he truly looked. His eyes were no longer searching for permission. They were searching for a way out. I didn't give him one, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because some lessons cannot be taught with words. As the room slowly emptied, I stayed seated for a while. I didn't rush to leave. I let everything settle. I listened to doors closing, footsteps fading away. I felt tired, but it was a clean kind of tiredness without regret. Before leaving the house, I stood in the hallway and looked at the walls I once believed symbolized my son's success. Now I saw them for what they were, just walls, nothing more, nothing less. Their value wasn't in how they looked, but in how they were built. Outside, the snow had stopped. The air was cold but clear. I walked down the steps just like on that Christmas night. But this time, I carried no tray of cookies. I carried clarity. And I knew that from this moment on, the illusion Julian and Vivian clung to had officially come to an end. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like I had done anything grand. I only knew that for the first time in many years, I had stopped standing behind the door. I had walked in, said what needed to be said, and walked out without carrying the shame of someone who had been sent away. On the way back, I thought about the people who would live in that house someday. They might never know who I was, and that was fine. What mattered was that the place would no longer be built on the silence of a father deemed inconvenient. For me, that was enough. After that day, I didn't reach out to Julian. I let things move at their own pace. When everything has been put back where it belongs, what comes next doesn't need emotional interference. I returned to the small seaside apartment I had rented while staying in Boston. In the mornings, the air carried a light scent of salt. In the evenings, it was quiet. I began to live more slowly, not to avoid anything, but because I no longer had to chase anyone. A few weeks passed. The procedures unfolded just as planned. I signed papers, answered the necessary questions, then folded everything away. Each time I felt a little lighter, not because I had taken something back, but because I had stopped losing more. I didn't follow news about Julian. I didn't ask around through mutual acquaintances. I understood that when someone has to face the consequences of their own choices, they need space to look straight at them. Then one afternoon, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, I saw Julian standing there. No expensive coat, no familiar sense of urgency. He looked tired but put together. He didn't speak right away. Neither did I. We stood there for a few seconds, long enough for both of us to understand this meeting wasn't for arguing. I invited him in. I made tea. Not my usual habit, but that day tea felt right. Julian said he hadn't come to ask for money. He said that if things became public, his career wouldn't survive. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, as if each sentence might make things worse. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I said I had no intention of turning his life into an example for anyone else. I said what I did wasn't revenge. I did it because I needed to end a system that had gone wrong. I said there are doors that once closed should not be used as threats. Julian lowered his head. He said he understood, but maybe too late. I didn't argue. I said that whether it was late or not wasn't for me to decide. Then I said one thing slowly. Dad didn't take back what he gave to hurt you. I took it back so you would have to stand on your own feet. I said, a man cannot build his life by erasing the person who stood behind him. We sat quietly for a while. There were no promises, no new agreements. I didn't offer long advice. I believe that when protection is removed, the best lesson is responsibility. Before leaving, Julian apologized. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was real. I nodded. For me, that was enough to close the chapter. After that, I began preparing for a trip I had postponed for far too long. I sold what I didn't need and packed light. I brought a few books, an old photo of my wife, and a kitchen knife that had been with me for many years. I wasn't leaving to escape the past. I was leaving to fulfill a promise to the woman who had walked with me through the hardest years. In the first days somewhere far away, I woke up early and walked along the shore, watching the sun rise. I ate simply. I talked with people I didn't need to impress. No one knew where I had stood in someone else's story, and that gave me a kind of relief I had never known. Sometimes I thought about Julian, not with bitterness, but with the distance that allows clarity. I hoped he would learn how to stand steady without hiding where he came from. I hoped he would understand that respect doesn't come from appearances, but from how you treat those who were there when you had nothing. The final scene of this story has no applause. Just me sitting under soft sunlight, taking a sip of coffee, and smiling. I realized that family isn't always the place that keeps you. Sometimes family is the place that taught you enough so you can walk forward without looking back. And for the first time in many years, I felt truly free. If you stayed with me until the end of this story, thank you for listening. If it made you think about family, about boundaries, or about your own worth, please like, subscribe, and share so stories like this can continue to be told. Sometimes the greatest lesson isn't holding tightly to what we give, but knowing when to stop to protect our dignity. Family is not built on silence and blind sacrifice, but on mutual respect. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.